Darkness past friend murder. Good evening and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I want to start by thanking you from the heart. Your support and presence here make this journey truly special. Preparing these mysteries is a labor of love, and it's so rewarding to see how many of you find comfort and delight in them. Our cozy community keeps growing, and that's thanks to you. If you'd like to help us share even more timeless stories, please remember to subscribe. Now, let's settle in and drift together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Friends and Old Photographs. The October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of autumnal melancholy that made even the most cheerful drawing room seem touched with shadows. In the assembly rooms, however, all was brightness and anticipation. Strands of bunting in faded red, white, and blue hung from the picture rails, giving the normally austere municipal chamber an almost festive air. The friends of St. Mary Mead had clearly spared no effort in preparing for their evening of historical reminiscence. Miss Jane Marple, arriving punctually at 10 minutes to 8, paused in the doorway to survey the scene with the quiet attention she brought to all social gatherings. Experience had taught her that such occasions, however innocent their stated purpose, often revealed more about human nature than many a dramatic crisis. "Jane, dear!" Lady Bantry swept forward, resplendent in purple velvet, despite the informality of the occasion. Dolly Bantry had never quite mastered the art of dressing down, a failing which Miss Marple found rather endearing. "You simply must see what Harold's arranged." Quite the theatrical production. Harold Brent stood near the front of the room, directing the placement of a magic lantern with the air of a man orchestrating a performance at Covent Garden. He was a smooth-featured gentleman of perhaps 55, with silver hair brushed back in careful waves, and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of a lifetime of organizing others to his satisfaction. At precisely 8, he was explaining to a small group of assembled worthies, "We shall have a little moment of darkness, purely for dramatic effect, you understand. And then the first slide will appear, St. Mary Mead through the decades, as our program so eloquently puts it." "Is that quite wise, Mr. Brent?" Lady Bantry inquired with characteristic directness. "These old buildings, you know, and people feeling about in the dark?" Colin Lyle looked up from where he was making final adjustments to the lantern apparatus. He was a lean, earnest man in his early 30s, with the slightly stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers that proclaimed the schoolmaster as surely as a uniform. "Oh, quite safe, Lady Bantry. I assure you I have the key to the fuse cupboard. And there's an emergency lamp that will come on almost immediately, just long enough for effect." Miss Marple accepted a typed program from Miss Evelyn Pryor, the honorary secretary of the Friends. Everything about Miss Pryor spoke of perfect organization: her neat gray suit, her carefully waved hair, her precise handwriting. The program was a model of clarity, with items listed in tidy columns and times noted to the minute. "Such beautiful work, Miss Pryor," Miss Marple murmured, studying the program with apparent admiration. Her sharp eyes, however, had noticed something else entirely. Beside 2 items, Founders Picnic 1908 and A Friend from the Past Portrait Studies, someone had penciled small, neat X marks in the margin. The front row of chairs had been arranged with military precision, and the center seat bore a small card reading Chairman. Miss Marple noted with interest that someone had taken particular care with this chair. The leather seat back gleamed with what appeared to be a recent application of furniture polish, applied rather more liberally than seemed strictly necessary. "Lucy, my dear, do be careful with that box." Miss Marple turned to observe a young woman of perhaps 25 struggling with what was evidently a container of considerable weight. Lucy Denham had the eager, slightly breathless manner of someone perpetually anxious to be helpful. Her connection with the local photographic club was evident from the array of equipment she carried, and her obvious familiarity with the technical aspects of their evening's entertainment. As Lucy set down the slide box, with a soft thump, Miss Marple noticed a small puff of dust escape from its edges when the lid was briefly opened. How curious. One would have expected Miss Denham to have cleaned everything thoroughly. She seemed precisely the type to take such responsibilities seriously. I do hope Harold hasn't been too ambitious with his historical narrative, murmured a voice at Miss Marple's elbow. She turned to find Mrs. Maud Ellison, a handsome woman in her 60s, whose bearing spoke of old-fashioned dignity. There was something in her tone that suggested less than complete approval of the chairman's methods. Oh? Miss Marple's voice held just the right note of polite inquiry. Harold has rather fixed ideas about how the past should be presented, Mrs. Ellison continued, her eyes following Brent as he moved about the room with proprietary satisfaction. He's quite fond of what he calls tidying up other people's memories. Sometimes, I wonder if he wouldn't prefer to rewrite history entirely, to suit his notion of how things ought to have been. Before Miss Marple could respond, a familiar voice, Inspector Slack, could be heard in the corridor, apparently bidding good night to someone. Dr. Haydock appeared in the doorway, followed by the Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda, and finally the postmistress, Miss Nora Pike, clutching her handbag with characteristic determination. Well, well, said Dr. Haydock, surveying the assembled company with a slightly sardonic air he brought to most social occasions. Quite the gathering of the local intelligentsia. I trust we're not to be subjected to Harold's theories about the beneficial effects of nostalgia on the digestive system. Now, Doctor? Griselda Clement laughed. Don't be horrid. I think it's perfectly lovely to celebrate our village history. Though I must say, she added, glancing around at the bunting and the carefully arranged chairs, it does look rather like a production. All we need is a murder, and we'd have quite the theatrical evening. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she settled into her chosen seat in the third row, close enough to observe, far enough back to remain unobtrusive. Something about the atmosphere of the room struck her as oddly expectant, though she could not quite put her finger on what created this impression. Perhaps it was the way Mr. Lyle kept checking his watch, or the manner in which Miss Pryor's eyes darted repeatedly to her perfectly typed program, or the fact that Mr. Brent seemed almost to be suppressing excitement rather than merely displaying enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Brent called the gathering to order with evident satisfaction, if you would kindly take your seats. We are about to embark on a journey through the treasured memories of our beloved St. Mary Mead. As the audience settled into their chairs, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her. Each person present had some connection to the village's past, some investment in the stories that would be told this evening, and in her long experience, she had learned that the past, however carefully curated, had a way of refusing to stay buried. The hands of the large clock above the door showed 28 minutes past 8. Now then, said Harold Brent, taking his position in the chairman's seat with evident relish, shall we begin our little journey into yesterday? Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle clicking as she waited for whatever was to come. Chapter Weens. 2. Blackout the minute. Hand of the assembly room clock moved with deliberate precision toward the half-hour mark. Harold Brent had positioned himself with theatrical flair beside his reserved chair, one hand resting lightly on its polished back, the other gesturing toward the magic lantern where Colin Lyle stood ready at the controls. And now, dear friends, Brent announced with the satisfied air of a conjurer about to perform his finest trick, we shall take our first step into the past. Mr. Lyle, if you would be so kind as to douse the lights. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their rhythmic knitting as she observed the small drama unfolding before her. There was something almost ritualistic about Brent's positioning, The way he settled into his chair with such precise timing, his profile outlined against the pale wall behind the makeshift stage. The clock's minute hand clicked into place. 8:30 exactly. The room plunged into absolute darkness. For Reeples, a moment there was only the natural rustle of an audience adjusting to sudden blindness. The small intake of breath from Lady Bantry somewhere to Miss Marple's left. The creak of chair springs as someone shifted position. The faint whisper of fabric against fabric. Then came other sounds, less easily explained. A soft bump, as though someone had misjudged the distance to a table in the darkness. A chair scraping briefly against the wooden floor, and then, cutting through the expectant silence like a blade, the sound that would haunt the memories of everyone present, a single sickening thud. Heavy and final, followed by a crash of something substantial hitting the ground. "I say!" Dr. Haydock's voice cut sharply through the darkness. "What was that?" Almost immediately, as Colin Lyle had promised, a side sconce flickered to life, casting an uneven pool of yellow light across the front of the room. The emergency lamp revealed a scene that transformed their cozy historical evening into something far more sinister. Harold Brent lay crumpled at the foot of the small dais, his silver hair dark with blood, his carefully pressed evening jacket twisted awkwardly beneath him. Beside his still form lay the heavy brass carrier from the magic lantern, its polished surface now stained with something that caught the lamplight with a dull gleam. Good God. The Reverend Clement's usually gentle voice cracked with shock. Lady Bantry's gasp was echoed by similar sounds of distress from around the room. Lucy Denham had pressed both hands to her mouth, her face pale in the wavering light. Miss Pryor sat frozen, her neat program clutched so tightly in her fingers that the paper had begun to tear. Dr. Haydock was already moving forward with the swift, purposeful stride that years of medical practice had ingrained in him. He knelt beside the fallen chairman, his fingers seeking a pulse that Miss Marple suspected he would not find. "Someone fetch Inspector Slack," he said grimly, confirming her fears. "I'm afraid Mr. Brent is beyond my help." Colin Lyle stood transfixed beside the magic lantern, his face a mask of bewilderment. "I don't understand," he stammered. "The emergency light should have come on almost immediately. There should have been no time for anything to happen. Pure panic. That's what this is." Inspector Slack's voice boomed from the doorway where he had appeared with remarkable promptitude, as though he had been lurking in the corridor awaiting just such a summons. "These blackouts, men stumble about, lose their bearings, fall and crack their skulls. Seen it dozens of times during the war." Miss Marple rose quietly from her seat and moved with unobtrusive care toward the front of the room. Lady Bantry, following with rather less discretion, studied the scene with the same careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern, noting details that others caught up in the immediate drama might overlook. Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination with a troubled frown. "I'm not so certain about that, Inspector. The injury is consistent with a blow from a blunt instrument, something with weight, but flexibility. Not the kind of damage one would expect from a simple fall." "Nonsense," Slack declared with his customary dismissiveness. "Man gets up in the dark, disoriented, takes a tumble. That lantern contraption there, heavy brass, sharp edges, obvious what happened." But Miss Marple was not listening to the inspector's confident pronouncements. Her attention had been drawn to something far more intriguing. While the others debated the cause of Harold Brent's demise, she had drifted toward the small cupboard that housed the electrical fuses, drawn by an instinct she could not quite explain. "Dolly," she murmured quietly to Lady Bantry, "would you mind stepping over here for a moment?" Lady Bantry, grateful for any distraction from the gruesome scene at the front of the room, joined her friend beside the cupboard. Miss Marple ran one finger along the lip of the metal housing, then held it up to catch the light from the emergency lamp. Her fingertip was distinctly gray. "How curious," she said softly. Opening the cupboard door with delicate care, she peered inside. The fuse that had apparently failed was indeed a fresh length of fine wire, as one might expect in a building that prided itself on proper maintenance. But something about its appearance troubled her. The break in the wire was not the clean snap one might expect from overload or age. Instead, it appeared jagged, and the porcelain housing showed a faint smear of what looked remarkably like graphite. More intriguing still was the small tin sitting on the shelf inside the cupboard, labeled in neat block letters, "Fuses." Miss Marple lifted the lid with careful fingers and discovered, nestled among several spare fuses, what appeared to be half of an ordinary HB pencil, its end showing clear evidence of having been chewed, a habit more common among schoolchildren than municipal maintenance workers. "Find something interesting, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock had approached quietly, leaving Inspector Slack to continue his increasingly animated discussion of accidental death with Colin Lyle. "Perhaps," she replied thoughtfully. "Tell me, Doctor, in your medical opinion, would graphite conduct electricity?" Haydock's eyebrows rose slightly. "Graphite? Why, yes, I believe it would. Carbon, you know, not as efficiently as proper metal, but it would carry a current. Might even heat up considerably under the right circumstances." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes returning to the peculiar contents of the fuse box. "And if one wished to create a delayed failure in an electrical circuit? Well, theoretically, I suppose one might substitute graphite for the proper fuse wire. The current would heat it and eventually—" He paused, studying her face with growing comprehension. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, you're not suggesting that this blackout was deliberately arranged?" Before she could answer, Colin Lyle's voice rose from the front of the room, tight with distress. "I simply don't understand it, Inspector. I checked all the fuses this afternoon. Everything was in perfect working order." "These things happen," Slack replied with brisk dismissal. "Old building, old wiring, probably been waiting to fail for months." But Miss Marple was studying the chewed pencil end with fascination. In her experience, people developed habits that were as distinctive as fingerprints. The precise pattern of tooth marks, the way the wood had been worried and split. These spoke of nervousness, of prolonged anxiety, and more importantly, they spoke of recent use. "Jane," Lady Bantry whispered urgently, "what is it?" "You've got that look. Nothing definite." "My dear, just an old woman's curiosity about the way things work." She paused, glancing back toward the scene of tragedy, where Inspector Slack was already beginning to direct the removal of the body. "Though I do find myself wondering about the timing of things." Such precise timing. As they rejoined the dispersing group, Miss Marple caught a fragment of conversation between Lucy Denham and Miss Pryor. "We should never have agreed to that business with the lights," Lucy was saying, her voice shaking. "Poor Mr. Brent. If only we'd simply begun with the slide straight away." "Harold was quite insistent about the dramatic effect," Miss Pryor replied, though her usual composure seemed badly shaken. "He said it would make the evening memorable." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she contemplated the bitter irony of that statement. The evening had indeed been memorable, though hardly in the way Harold Brent had intended. The question that occupied her thoughts as the assembly room slowly emptied was not whether Harold Brent's death had been an accident. She was increasingly certain it had not. The question was rather more complex. Who among their small gathering had possessed both the technical knowledge to engineer such a precisely timed blackout and the cold-blooded determination to use those crucial moments of darkness to commit murder? Chapter 3, Miss Marple Notices Graphite. The morning following the tragedy found St. Mary Mead with a peculiar mixture of horror and excitement that accompanies any violent death in a small village. Miss Marple, having slept little and thought much, arrived at the assembly rooms just as Inspector Slack was concluding what he clearly considered a routine investigation. "Open and shut case," he was declaring to Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Clement, who had apparently felt compelled to return to the scene. Poor fellow got up in the dark, lost his bearings, took a tumble. That heavy brass contraption did the rest. Tragic, but these things happen. Miss Marple paused in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the morning scene. The cheerful bunting from the previous evening hung limp and somehow full in the gray daylight. The magic lantern stood silent and reproachful, its brass fittings dulled without the warm glow of artificial light. "Inspector," she ventured with the diffident tone that had served her so well over the years, "I wonder if I might take another look at that fuse cupboard. I'm afraid I'm rather curious about electrical matters, having had such troubles with the wiring at home." Slack waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing to see there, Miss Marple. Simple failure happens all the time in these old buildings. Probably been deteriorating for months." But Dr. Haydock, who had not forgotten their brief conversation the previous evening, stepped forward. "Actually, Inspector, I think Miss Marple may have observed something worth investigating. Perhaps we might examine the fuse together." With obvious reluctance, Slack followed them to the small electrical cupboard. In the clearer light of day, the evidence that had puzzled Miss Marple appeared even more intriguing. The failed fuse wire, when examined closely, showed not the typical signs of overload, but rather a peculiar blackening that seemed inconsistent with normal electrical failure. "Most curious," murmured Dr. Haydock, adjusting his spectacles to peer more closely at the porcelain housing. "This smearing here is not the usual carbon deposit one would expect from arcing. It's more like pencil lead. Graphite, to be precise," Miss Marple finished quietly. She reached carefully into the cupboard and withdrew the small tin labeled "fuses." Opening it revealed not only the spare fuses one might expect, but also that peculiar half-pencil, its nibbed end bearing clear evidence of nervous chewing. "I say," the Reverend Clement observed, studying the pencil with growing fascination, "that's rather an odd thing to keep with electrical supplies, isn't it?" Inspector Slack snatched the tin with ill grace. Perfectly normal to keep notes about maintenance work. Nothing suspicious about a pencil in a fuse box, but Miss Marple was now examining the broken fuse wire itself with the kind of methodical attention she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. "Inspector, if I might venture an opinion based on my admittedly limited understanding of electrical matters, this wire appears to have been deliberately tampered with." "Tampered with?" Slack's tone conveyed profound skepticism. "The break is not clean, as one would expect from simple overload. Instead, it appears that someone has substituted graphite, pencil lead, for a portion of the wire. When the current passed through it, the graphite would have heated and eventually parted, creating a precisely timed failure." Dr. Haydock examined the evidence with growing excitement. "By George, I believe she's right. Graphite would carry current, but inefficiently. It would heat up, expand, and eventually break the circuit. And if one knew the approximate power draw of the magic lantern, one could calculate almost exactly when the failure would occur. Such as," Miss Marple finished, "for instance, at precisely 8:30, the three men stared at her in silence, the implications of her observation gradually sinking in. If the blackout had been deliberately engineered, then Harold Brent's death was no accident." "Preposterous," Slack declared, though with less conviction than before. "Who would go to such elaborate lengths? And why?" Miss Marple carefully closed the fuse tin and replaced it on the shelf. "As to who, Inspector, I suspect we need look no further than someone with both the technical knowledge to accomplish such a substitution and access to this cupboard. As to why?" She paused, her eyes distant with thought. I believe that may require a closer examination of what Mr. Brent intended to reveal last evening. Colin Lyle chose that moment to appear in the doorway, looking haggard and considerably more disheveled than his usual neat appearance would. Suggest, Inspector Slack. I've brought the key to the fuse cupboard as you requested, though I'm not sure what more there is to examine. The schoolmaster's arrival created an interesting tableau. Miss Marple found herself studying his ink-stained fingers with renewed interest, particularly noting the faint gray smudging that might or might not be ordinary classroom chalk. "Mr. Lyle," she said gently, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but you mentioned yesterday evening that you always keep notes about electrical maintenance. Might I ask what sort of notes?" Lyle shifted uncomfortably under her mild gaze. "Nothing elaborate, Miss Marple. Just basic records. When fuses were changed, any problems with the wiring, that sort of thing. One can't be too careful with these old buildings, of course." "And you keep these notes on paper?" "Usually, yes. Sometimes just rough calculations on whatever's to hand." His eyes flickered toward the pencil in the fuse tin, then away again. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Such a practical habit. I imagine it requires considerable knowledge to maintain electrical systems safely." "Oh, well, one picks these things up. The school board expects us to handle basic maintenance ourselves, you see. Economy measures." Dr. Haydock had been following this exchange with evident fascination. "Tell me, Lyle, how precisely would one calculate the timing for an electrical failure? Hypothetically speaking, of course." The color drained from Lyle's face. I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Doctor." Simple enough question. If one knew the power consumption of a particular device and the resistance characteristics of a substitute material, one could presumably calculate when that material would fail under load. Lyle's hands, Miss Marple noticed, had begun to tremble slightly. "I suppose, theoretically, such calculations might be possible, though I can't imagine why anyone would want to. Can't you?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was something in her tone that made Lyle take a step backward. "I find myself wondering about the timing of yesterday evening's events, Mr. Lyle. Such precise timing, almost as though someone had planned for the lights to fail at exactly 8:30. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of village life continuing its normal course outside the assembly rooms. Inspector Slack, for once, seemed uncertain how to proceed. The evidence before them suggested a level of premeditation that transformed what he had dismissed as a simple accident into something far more sinister. "Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple continued in her most grandmotherly tone, "I notice you have a small smudge on your cuff there. Such a distinctive gray color, almost like graphite, wouldn't you say?" Lyle glanced down at his sleeve with poorly concealed alarm. "Chalk dust, I expect. Occupational hazard in my profession." "Of course. Though I must say, it looks remarkably similar to the residue we found in the fuse cupboard." Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared in her hands as though by magic, clicking with soft rhythm as she spoke. "Tell me, have you been doing any pencil sharpening recently? The kind that leaves those distinctive little cedar shavings?" The question seemed to hit Lyle like a physical blow. He opened his mouth as though to respond, then closed it again, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, fear, and something that might have been resignation. Inspector Slack, finally grasping the direction of Miss Marple's questions, stepped forward with renewed authority. "Now then, Mr. Lyle, I think you'd better explain exactly what you were doing in that fuse cupboard yesterday." But Miss Marple held up one gentle hand. "Perhaps, Inspector, we might first establish exactly what Mr. Brent intended to reveal last evening. I have a feeling that understanding his plans may illuminate our suspect's motives quite clearly." Chapter 4: The Seat That Glowed. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the assembly rooms, casting long rectangles of golden light across the floor, where Harold Brent had fallen mere hours before. Miss Marple stood contemplating the chairman's reserved seat, her head tilted slightly in the manner of a bird considering an interesting specimen. "Dolly, dear," she said to Lady Bantry, who had insisted upon accompanying her for this return visit, "would you mind terribly helping me with a small experiment?" Lady Bantry, who had been uncharacteristically subdued since witnessing the previous evening's tragedy, looked up with something approaching relief. "Of course, Jane. What did you have in mind?" Miss Marple approached the leather chair that had been Harold Brent's chosen throne for the evening's festivities. In daylight, it appeared perfectly ordinary, a well-maintained piece of municipal furniture, its seat back gleaming with what still appeared to be an unusually liberal application of furniture polish. "I noticed something rather peculiar about this chair last evening," Miss Marple murmured, running her fingertips lightly across the polished leather. "The way it caught the light, or rather, the way it seemed to hold light even after the lamps were extinguished." "I'm not sure I follow. Dear, would you be so kind as to close those curtains just for a moment? I should like to recreate the conditions we experienced during that unfortunate blackout." Lady Bantry, though puzzled, complied with her friend's request. The room dimmed considerably, though not to the absolute darkness they had experienced the previous evening. "Now then," Miss Marple said, producing a small electric torch from her handbag, "if you would just step over to that wall switch and turn off the remaining lights." The assembly rooms plunged into proper darkness. For a moment, both women stood still, allowing their eyes to adjust. Then Miss Marple heard Lady Bantry's sharp intake of breath. "Good heavens, Jane, look at the chair." Along the top edge of the chair back, where someone might rest their head while leaning back, a faint greenish glow emanated from the leather. It was barely perceptible, like the dying embers of a fire, but unmistakably present. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction. "Quite literally, one might say." Lady Bantry restored the electric lighting with evident haste. "What on earth is that substance?" Miss Marple examined the glowing area more closely in the restored illumination. To the naked eye, the greenish tinge was completely invisible under normal lighting conditions. Only in total darkness did the phosphorescent quality reveal itself. "Unless I am very much mistaken," she said thoughtfully, "this appears to be luminous paint, the sort they used during the war for various purposes, marking emergency exits, painting watch faces, that sort of thing. But who would put luminous paint on a chair, and why?" Before Miss Marple could respond, they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Colin Lyle appeared in the doorway, looking even more haggard than he had that morning. Behind him came Lucy Denham, clutching a canvas bag with her characteristic nervous energy. "Oh," Lucy exclaimed upon seeing the two ladies. "I didn't expect anyone to be here. I've just come to collect the photographic equipment." "Such a dreadful business. And now Inspector Slack says we mustn't touch anything until he's completed his investigation." Miss Marple studied the young woman's earnest face with interest. "How thoughtful of you to take responsibility for the equipment, Miss Denham. I imagine some of it is quite valuable." "Oh yes, particularly the slides. Some of those photographs are irreplaceable historical documents. It would be tragic if anything happened to them, on top of everything else." Colin Lyle had been standing silently near the door, but now he stepped forward with apparent reluctance. "Miss Marple, I understand you've been asking questions about the electrical systems. I want you to know that I checked everything thoroughly yesterday afternoon. The fuses, the wiring, everything was in perfect order." "I'm sure it was, Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess myself curious about one small detail. You mentioned yesterday that you sometimes use materials from the school for various purposes here at the assembly rooms, Storage of supplies, temporary signage, that sort of thing. Lyle's face grew wary. Occasionally, yes, with proper authorization, of course. The Friends Committee has a very limited budget for such things. Naturally. I was wondering particularly about those old ARP signs that Miss Denham mentioned, the ones stored in the back room. Lucy looked up sharply from her equipment bag. ARP signs? Oh, yes. There are several old wartime notices back there. Emergency exit markers, blackout instructions, that sort of thing. Mr. Lyle mentioned he'd moved one yesterday to prop open a door that kept swinging shut. Indeed. Miss Marple's interest seemed purely academic. And these signs, I suppose some of them might have been painted with luminous paint for visibility during blackouts. Certainly, Lyle replied, though his voice had taken on a strained quality. Standard practice during the war. Practical stuff, though I imagine most of it would have faded by now. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine Harold Brent's evening jacket, which still hung over the back of his chair, where it had been left after the body was removed. With delicate fingers, she turned back the collar. "How very interesting," she murmured. Lady Bantry peered over her shoulder. "What is it, Jane?" "Several small green specks here on the collar, quite tiny, but distinctly visible if one knows where to look." Miss Marple glanced up at Lyle and Lucy, almost as though someone had handled luminous paint and then come into contact with Mr. Brent's jacket. The silence that followed was heavy, with unspoken implications. Lucy Denham had gone very pale, while Colin Lyle seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. "Miss Marple," Lyle said finally, his voice tight with strain, "I think you may be reading too much into these coincidences. There are any number of ways such marks might have appeared." "Oh, I'm sure you're quite right," Miss Marple replied with disarming mildness. "I do have a tendency to see patterns where none exist. Though I must say, it does seem rather remarkable that someone should have taken the trouble to mark Mr. Brent's chair with luminous paint on the very evening when a precisely timed blackout was arranged." She paused, allowing the implications of her words to settle. "One might almost think that someone wanted to be able to see exactly where Mr. Brent was sitting during those crucial moments of darkness." Lucy Denham dropped her equipment bag with a clatter. "You can't possibly be suggesting that someone deliberately that this was planned." "I'm merely observing, my dear," Miss Marple replied, "though I must admit the evidence does seem to point in that direction. A timed electrical failure, luminous marking on the victim's chair, and someone with both the technical knowledge and physical access to arrange such things." Colin Lyle had grown very still, his face cycling through a series of expressions that suggested a man wrestling with a terrible decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The paint," he said slowly, "came from an old fire exit sign. It was stored in the back room with other wartime materials. I moved it yesterday to prop open the door to the kitchen, and in the process, some of the paint transferred to your fingers. It's old paint. Powdery. It comes off easily if you're not careful." Miss Marple's tone remained gently encouraging. Lyle looked down at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I didn't realize, that is, I never intended—" But before he could complete whatever confession seemed to be forming, the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor announced Inspector Slack's return. The moment of revelation, if that was what it had been, passed as Lyle straightened and resumed his previous expression of guarded weariness. Miss Marple sighed softly and continued her knitting, but her bright eyes missed nothing as the drama continued to unfold around Harold Brent's empty chair. Chapter 5. A caption written twice. Inspector Slack's arrival brought with it the familiar atmosphere of official bustle and barely concealed impatience that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He surveyed the small, gathering in the assembly rooms with the air of a man who had better things to do than indulge in what he clearly considered amateur theorizing. Still here, Miss Marple? I thought I'd made it clear that this was a straightforward case of accidental death. No need for further investigation. Miss Marple smiled with the gentle persistence that had served her so well over the years. Of course, Inspector. I was merely satisfying my curiosity about some of the historical photographs. Fascinating glimpses into our village's past. She moved toward the magic lantern, where several slides had been left scattered across a small table. The apparatus itself stood silent and somehow accusatory in the afternoon light. Its brass fittings dulled without the warm glow that had been intended to bring the past to life. Mr. Lyle was just explaining about the old ARP materials, she continued conversationally, selecting one particular slide for closer examination. So many interesting relics from wartime days, though I must say, this photograph puzzles me somewhat. The slide she held showed a group of cheerfully dressed villagers arranged around a laden picnic table. Their Edwardian finery spoke of more leisurely times. The caption, neatly lettered in white ink along the bottom edge, read, "Picnic 1908. Charming scene, Lady Bantry observed, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. Though those fashions look rather more recent than 1908, don't they? Miss Marple's eyes had taken on the particular sharpness that indicated her mind was working along lines invisible to others. Indeed they do, Dolly. That hat on the lady to the left, for instance, quite distinctly the style that became popular around 1911. And the gentleman's collar, definitely post-1910 fashion. Colin Lyle, who had been attempting to fade into the background since Inspector Slack's arrival, shifted uncomfortably. Photography dating can be quite unreliable, Miss Marple. Fashions varied considerably and people often kept clothing for years. Oh, quite so, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though I find myself curious about something else entirely. She moved to the display table where several photograph albums lay open, apparently abandoned when the evening's proceedings had taken their tragic turn. This same image appears here in the village scrapbook. She indicated a carefully mounted photograph, identical to the slide except for its presentation. The caption beneath it, written in faded brown ink, clearly read, "Founders Picnic, 1908. How nice that someone took such care to preserve the correct date, she murmured, then paused, tilting her head slightly. Though there does seem to be something underneath this label. With delicate care, she lifted one corner of the pasted caption. Beneath it, visible in pencil, were the faint marks of another date, one that had been carefully covered over. 1911, she read aloud. How very curious that someone should have gone to the trouble of changing the date. The silence that followed was broken, only by the distant sound of village traffic and the soft rustle of Miss Pryor's papers as she nervously sorted through the evening's abandoned programs, perhaps, suggested Dr. Haydock, who had arrived during the previous exchange. There was simply some confusion about the correct year. Easy enough mistake to make? Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though the penciling underneath appears to be in the same hand as these markings on the program. She indicated the neat X marks that had caught her attention the previous evening. Such distinctive penmanship, that high E and the long tail on the R, quite unmistakable once one notices it. Evelyn Pryor looked up sharply from her papers. Those aren't my markings, if that's what you're suggesting. I typed the programs, but I certainly didn't pencil anything on them. Of course not, my dear. Your typewriting is quite perfect, not a single error to be seen. These pencil marks were clearly added later by someone else entirely. She moved to examine another slide, this one showing a formal portrait of a distinguished gentleman in military uniform. The caption read, "A friend from the past, Colonel Weatherby, 1943. This was to be the final item of the evening, wasn't it? Mr. Brent's special presentation? Miss Marple looked inquiringly at Miss Pryor, who nodded reluctantly. Harold was quite excited about it. He said he had some important historical corrections to make. Setting the record straight, he called it. Something about wartime distributions and ensuring proper recognition. Colin Lyle had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. When Miss Marple's eyes turned to him with their mild but penetrating gaze, he seemed to shrink visibly. "Mr. Lyle," she said gently, "I notice your handwriting on the school notice board bears a remarkable resemblance to these pencil markings, that same distinctive formation of letters. Have you perhaps been helping with the historical research for this evening's presentation?" Lyle's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before he managed to find his voice. That is, Mr. Brent did ask for my assistance with some of the dating, village records. You understand? Sometimes there are discrepancies that need to be resolved. How very helpful of you. And did Mr. Brent explain why he felt these particular dates needed correction? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Lyle glanced around the room as though seeking escape, his eyes finally settling on Inspector Slack with something approaching desperation. "I really don't see what any of this has to do with the accident," he said with forced lightness. Historical research hardly seems relevant to poor Harold's unfortunate fall. But Miss Marple was not to be deterred. "Oh, but I think it may be very relevant indeed. You see, Mr. Lyle, I'm beginning to suspect that Mr. Brent's historical corrections were not merely academic exercises. I believe he intended to use last evening's presentation to reveal certain uncomfortable truths about wartime activities in St. Mary Mead." The atmosphere in the room had grown noticeably tense. Even Inspector Slack seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding, though his expression suggested he remained skeptical about its importance. "What sort of truths?" Dr. Haydock asked quietly. Miss Marple carefully replaced the slides on the table, arranging them with the same methodical precision she brought to her. Knitting. "I suspect Mr. Brent had discovered irregularities in the distribution of wartime relief supplies. The kind of irregularities that might reflect poorly on certain local families whose reputations have remained unblemished for more than a decade." Colin Lyle made a sound that might have been a protest, or simply a sharp intake of breath. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, had begun to tremble again. "The 1908 picnic photograph," she continued conversationally, "was moved to 1911 to obscure certain social connections that might prove embarrassing. But the real concern, I suspect, involved more recent history. The kind of history that Mr. Brent was planning to reveal under the guise of honoring a friend from the past." She turned to face Lyle directly, her expression compassionate but unwavering. "Tell me, Mr. Lyle, what exactly did Mr. Brent discover about your father's wartime activities? What truth was he planning to share with the assembled friends of St. Mary Mead?" The question struck its target with devastating accuracy. Lyle's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely, and for a moment he looked like nothing so much as a schoolboy caught in an elaborate mischief. "My father," he whispered, "was a good man. He helped people during the war. If there were irregularities in the records, it was only because he knew who really needed help. I'm sure he was acting from the best of motives," Miss Marple said gently. "But Mr. Brent saw things differently, didn't he? He viewed your father's actions as theft, perhaps even profiteering, at the expense of those in genuine need." The admission hung between them, unspoken, but clearly understood by everyone present. Inspector Slack, finally grasping the implications, stepped forward with renewed authority. "Now then, Mr. Lyle, I think you'd better explain exactly what Mr. Brent was planning to reveal last evening." Chapter 6. The Slide Box with Dust. The Revelation of Harold. Brent's intended exposure seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Colin Lyle stood frozen beside the magic lantern, his face bearing the expression of a man who had watched his carefully constructed world begin to crumble around him. Miss Marple, however, was not yet finished with her methodical examination of the evidence. While Inspector Slack began what promised to be a lengthy interrogation of the increasingly distressed schoolmaster, she turned her attention to the heavy slide box that Lucy Denham had handled with such obvious care the previous evening. "Miss Denham," she said gently, "I believe you mentioned that you had cleaned all the photographic slides yesterday afternoon. Such conscientious preparation." Lucy, who had been watching the exchange between Slack and Lyle with evident distress, started at being addressed. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. I spent the better part of the afternoon with them. Each slide was dusted and polished until it gleamed. I do take such pride in proper presentation." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, then bent to examine the slide carrier that still lay near where Harold Brent's body had been found. The brass instrument, despite its grim association with the evening's tragedy, retained an air of mechanical precision that spoke well of its craftsmanship. "Such beautiful workmanship," she observed, running one finger along the grooved channels where the slides would have been inserted, "though I noticed there seems to be some residue in these grooves. A fine white powder of some sort." Lady Bantry peered over her friend's shoulder with interest. "Rather a lot of dust for something that was supposedly cleaned yesterday." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And such an unusual consistency. Not at all like ordinary household dust." She touched the powder delicately with her fingertip, then held it up to catch the light. "Almost crystalline in nature, rather like the residue one might find from a broken electric light bulb." Lucy Denham's face had gone very pale. "I'm sure I cleaned everything thoroughly. Perhaps dust settled during the evening, or—" But Miss Marple was already moving toward the equipment table where the magic lantern accessories were stored. Among the spare parts and cleaning cloths, she discovered 2 small glass bulbs of the type used in photographic flash equipment. One remained intact, but the other showed clear evidence of having been deliberately crushed. "How very curious," she remarked, holding up the broken bulb for general inspection. "This appears to have been shattered quite recently. The glass fragments are still sharp, and there's that same white powder coating the inside surface." Dr. Haydock approached with professional interest. "Magnesium powder, I should think. Standard component in flashbulbs of that era. Highly combustible when ignited, but quite harmless in its powdered form. Harmless, perhaps, but certainly distinctive." Miss Marple carefully examined the broken bulb, noting how the magnesium coating had been distributed. One might almost think someone had deliberately crushed this bulb to obtain the powder. She moved back to Harold Brent's abandoned chair, where his evening jacket still hung over the back. With careful attention to detail, she examined the greasy patch on the chair back where the luminous paint had been applied. "Most interesting," she murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from her handbag with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone accustomed to detailed examination. "There appears to be a single grain of this white powder embedded in the polish here." The implications of this discovery seemed to strike everyone present simultaneously. If someone had deliberately applied both luminous paint and magnesium powder to the chairman's seat, it suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the evening's events from accident to calculated murder. Colin Lyle, who had been answering Inspector Slack's increasingly pointed questions with growing reluctance, suddenly stopped speaking entirely, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple's magnifying glass with something approaching horror. "The powder would serve a practical purpose," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. "Applied to one's hands or gloves, it would provide additional grip in darkness, essential, one might think, for someone planning to swing a heavy object with precision in absolute blackout conditions." Lucy Denham had been growing increasingly agitated during this discussion. You can't possibly think that anyone would deliberately. It's monstrous to suggest such things. Oh, my dear child, I'm not suggesting anything about you, Miss Marple replied with gentle reassurance. Your distress at yesterday evening's tragedy was clearly genuine. No one could doubt your innocence in this matter. She paused, her attention returning to the slide box that had caused the original puff of dust when Lucy had opened it, though I do find myself wondering about the timing of when this magnesium powder found its way into the equipment. You cleaned everything yesterday afternoon, you said? Yes, absolutely everything. Each slide was individually polished. The carriers were cleaned. Even the storage box was dusted inside and out. And yet, when you opened the box yesterday evening, there was clearly visible dust. Dust that we now know included magnesium powder from a deliberately broken flashbulb. Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared again, their soft clicking providing an oddly domestic counterpoint to the growing tension in the room. This suggests that someone visited your cleaned equipment after you had finished your preparations. But before the evening's presentation began, Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing attention, stepped forward. Are you saying someone deliberately contaminated the photographic equipment? I'm saying that someone with access to the assembly rooms took considerable care to prepare for yesterday evening's events. They arranged for a precisely timed electrical failure, marked the victim's location with luminous paint, and ensured they would have adequate grip for their weapon by dusting their hands with magnesium powder. The methodical nature of the preparations was becoming clear to everyone present. This had been no crime of passion, no sudden violent impulse born of the moment. Someone had planned Harold Brent's death with the same careful attention to detail that a teacher might bring to preparing a complex lesson. Mr. Lyle, Miss Marple said, turning her mild gaze upon the increasingly distressed schoolmaster, you have access to the assembly rooms at all hours. Don't you, as the person responsible for maintaining the electrical systems? Lyle's voice when he finally spoke was barely audible. The committee gave me a key for maintenance purposes. Someone has to be able to respond to emergencies, of course. And you would have had ample opportunity to visit the building after Miss Denham completed her cleaning. But before the evening's events began, time enough to break a flashbulb, apply luminous paint to the chairman's seat, and prepare the fuse box with your graphite. Substitution. The silence that followed was broken, only by the sound of Lady Bantry's sharp intake of breath and the continued clicking of Miss Marple's needles. Outside, the normal sounds of village life continued, but inside the assembly rooms, the weight of revelation pressed down upon them all. Colin Lyle stood with his shoulders hunched, staring at the floor as though it might offer some escape from the inexorable logic of Miss Marple's deductions. When he finally looked up, his eyes held the defeated expression of a man who had run out of places to hide. The powder, he said quietly, was insurance. In absolute darkness, one needs every possible advantage. I couldn't afford to miss. Inspector Slack stepped forward with grim satisfaction. Colin Lyle, I am arresting you for the murder of Harold Brent. But Miss Marple held up one gentle hand. Perhaps, Inspector, we might allow Mr. Lyle to explain his actions fully. I believe there are still details of this carefully planned crime that deserve our attention. Chapter 7. 2 Programs. 1 Hand. The weight of Colin Lyle's partial confession settled over the assembly rooms like a heavy shroud. Inspector Slack, clearly relishing this vindication of what he now chose to remember as his own investigative instincts, had begun the formal process of cautioning the schoolmaster, when Miss Marple raised her hand with gentle but unmistakable authority. If I might suggest, Inspector, there are still several aspects of this case that warrant clarification before we proceed to formal charges. Slack's expression conveyed his opinion of amateur interference, But something in Miss Marple's tone gave him pause. What sort of aspects? The question of premeditation, for one thing. While Mr. Lyle has admitted to careful preparation, I believe the evidence suggests this crime was planned well in advance of yesterday's events. She turned toward the village postmistress, who had been standing quietly near the door throughout the proceedings. Miss Pike, I believe you mentioned having a spare program from last evening, Nora. Pike stepped forward with the purposeful stride that characterized all her movements. As postmistress of St. Mary Mead, she had developed an eye for detail that rivaled Miss Marple's own, though she applied it primarily to the management of mail and the observation of village affairs. Indeed I do, Miss Marple. Someone handed it in this morning, said they'd found it in the street outside. Thought it might be wanted for the investigation, what with poor Mr. Brent and all. She produced a folded program from her handbag, identical to the ones Miss Pryor had prepared with such care. Miss Marple accepted the program with evident interest, unfolding it to reveal the familiar neat columns of typewritten text, but more significant than the printing were the penciled marks in the margin, the same small X marks that had caught her attention the previous evening. Most illuminating, she murmured, comparing this program with one she had retained from the previous evening. The markings are identical. Same hand, same distinctive letter formations, that high E and the characteristic tail on the R that we observed earlier. She moved to the school notice board that hung near the entrance, where several official announcements were posted in Colin Lyle's neat handwriting. The comparison was unmistakable. The hand that marked both programs, she announced with quiet certainty, is the same hand that wrote these school notices, Mr. Lyle's hand. Dr. Haydock studied the evidence with professional fascination. You're suggesting he marked multiple programs in advance? I'm suggesting that Mr. Lyle prepared for this evening's events with considerable forethought. The X marks indicate precisely which items in the program would require special attention, the blackout timing and the slide that was never to be shown, Colin. Lyle's face had grown ashen during this exchange. When Miss Marple's clear gaze settled upon him, he seemed to crumple inwardly. The programs, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. I marked them during the week. I knew Harold's schedule, knew what he planned to reveal. The timing had to be perfect. Miss Evelyn Pryor, who had been listening with growing horror, stepped forward with indignant protest. You used my programs, my careful work, as ammunition for your terrible scheme. I never meant, Lyle began, then stopped, apparently recognizing the futility of justification. Miss Marple's needles continued their soft clicking as she pieced together the final elements of the crime. Tell me, Mr. Lyle, when exactly did Mr. Brent inform you of his intentions regarding your father's wartime activities? Last Tuesday, he came to the school. Said he'd been researching village history and had uncovered some irregularities. He seemed to take pleasure in the prospect of setting the record straight, as he put it. And you realized immediately what this would mean for your family's reputation. Lyle nodded miserably. My father was a good man who made difficult choices during desperate times. Harold made it sound like common theft, profiteering from others' misery. He had documents, photographs, testimony from people who remembered the wartime distributions. Lady Bantry, who had been following this revelation with fascination, leaned forward. So you decided that Mr. Brent couldn't be allowed to give his presentation? I tried reasoning with him first, offered to make amends, suggested private acknowledgement rather than public humiliation. But Harold was set on his course. He said the truth deserved to be told regardless of the consequences for those involved. Miss Marple's expression held a mixture of understanding and sadness. And so you began planning his death. I told myself I was only going to frighten him, force him to reconsider his position. But as the week progressed, As I realized how determined he was to proceed, I began preparing in earnest. The pencil marks on the programs, the graphite substitution in the fuse, the luminous paint and magnesium powder, each element carefully calculated to ensure success. Inspector Slack, who had been taking notes with increasing vigor, looked up sharply. Premeditated murder, then no question of accident or manslaughter. The full implications of this designation seemed to strike Lyle like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the equipment table for support, his knuckles white with strain. "I want you to understand," he said desperately. "My father helped people during the war. Yes, he redirected some supplies, but only to families he knew were in genuine need. The official distribution list didn't account for real circumstances. Elderly people too proud to ask for help. Families with children who were going without. I'm sure your father acted from compassion," Miss Marple replied gently. But Mr. Brent saw only the irregularities in the records. He had no interest in understanding the human circumstances that motivated your father's decisions. Harold collected evidence like a prosecutor building a case. He had photographs of hampers going to the wrong families, testimonies from people who remembered receiving unexpected assistance. He was going to present it all as a systematic theft of charitable supplies. Dr. Haydock shook his head sadly. "So you decided that murder was preferable to public disgrace." "I decided that my family's honor was worth protecting," Lyle corrected with a flash of his earlier defiance. "My father died believing he had served his community well. I couldn't allow Harold to turn him into a villain for the sake of historical accuracy." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their movement. "Tell me, Mr. Lyle, did you consider what would happen to your own honor if your crime were discovered?" The question seemed to penetrate Lyle's defensive facade. For a moment he looked genuinely confused, as though the possibility of discovery had never seriously occurred to him. That is, I believed I had planned carefully enough to avoid suspicion. The blackout, the apparent accident, it seemed like a perfect solution. But you overlooked the human element, Miss Marple observed. The fact that people notice things, remember details, ask questions when something doesn't seem quite right. She gestured toward the assembled evidence, the marked programs, the residue of magnesium powder, the traces of luminous paint. You planned the mechanical aspects of your crime with admirable precision, but you failed to account for the curiosity of ordinary people who care about their community. Colin? Lyle stood silent for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of his failure. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the defeated tone of a man who had run out of deceptions. "I suppose I thought protecting my father's memory justified any means necessary. I was wrong." Chapter 8. The Teacher's Spare. Fuse. The afternoon light had begun to fade as Miss Marple continued her methodical examination of the evidence, while Inspector Slack busied himself with the formal aspects of Colin Lyle's arrest. She found herself drawn to the schoolmaster's leather satchel, which sat abandoned near the magic lantern like a testament to interrupted routine. "Inspector," she said with her characteristic diffidence, "I wonder if you might permit me to examine Mr. Lyle's belongings. I believe there may be additional evidence that would complete our understanding of how this crime was planned." Slack waved a dismissive hand, clearly eager to conclude what he now regarded as a satisfactory case. "By all means, Miss Marple, though I think we have quite enough evidence to proceed." With careful precision, Miss Marple opened the worn leather case that had clearly seen years of faithful service. The contents spoke eloquently of a schoolmaster's daily concerns: exercise books marked in red ink, a slide rule, several pieces of chalk, and various other educational paraphernalia. But among these innocent items, her sharp eyes detected objects that told a rather different story. "Most interesting," she murmured, withdrawing a coil of fine electrical wire identical to that used in the assembly room's fuse box. Such a thoughtful teacher carrying spare fuses for emergency repairs. Colin Lyle, who had been standing in dejected silence since his partial confession, looked up with something approaching hope. Perfectly normal for someone responsible for building maintenance. The school board expects us to handle minor electrical problems ourselves. Of course, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though I noticed this wire has been recently cut, several small pieces missing from the coil. She held up the wire to catch the light, examining the clean cuts with professional interest. One might say these were precisely measured lengths, removed for a specific purpose. Dr. Haydock approached to examine the evidence more closely. The wire looks identical to what we found in the fuse box. Same gauge, same composition. Indeed. And here's something else of interest. Miss Marple had discovered a pencil sharpened to an unusual degree of fineness. The wood showed clear evidence of having been whittled with a knife rather than a conventional sharpener, creating the kind of precise point that might be required for delicate electrical work. Lady Bantry peered over her friend's shoulder with fascination. That's been sharpened down to almost nothing, hasn't it? Precisely the sort of preparation one might make if one intended to use the graphite core for a specific purpose, Miss Marple's needles resumed, their gentle clicking as she contemplated the implications. Tell me, Mr. Lyle, when did you first conceive the idea of using graphite to create a timed electrical failure? Lyle's face cycled through several expressions before settling on resigned defeat. Wednesday evening, I was marking papers when the idea occurred to me. Graphite conducts electricity, but not efficiently. Under load, it would heat up and eventually part the circuit. And you tested this theory at the school? Yes. I rigged a small demonstration with a torch battery and a piece of pencil lead. The timing was quite predictable once I calculated the resistance characteristics. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Such scientific thoroughness. I imagine your pupils would be impressed by your practical application of electrical principles. The bitter irony in her tone was not lost on anyone present. Here was a man who had perverted his educational skills in service of murder, turning the tools of learning into instruments of death. There's more, she continued, reaching deeper into the satchel. Her fingers encountered a folded piece of paper that crackled with age. Withdrawing it carefully, she discovered a fragment of wartime signage, its surface marked with a distinctive lettering of ARP instructions. The paper bore traces of luminous paint along one edge, and its corner showed clear evidence of having been smudged with the characteristic green residue they had observed on Harold Brent's collar. A piece of an old fire exit sign, I believe, Miss Marple observed, marked with wartime luminous paint for visibility during blackouts. How convenient that such materials should be readily available in the school storage areas. Colin Lyle's voice, when he spoke, carried the hollow tone of complete defeat. The ARP materials have been stored in the school basement since the war ended. No one ever bothered to dispose of them properly. And you realize that the old luminous paint, though faded, would still provide enough glow to mark a target in absolute darkness. The paint is powdery now, comes off easily if you handle it. I tested it one evening after school. Just a small application, to see if it would still luminesce. Miss Marple's examination of the satchel had revealed one final piece of evidence, a pair of worn work gloves, their palms stained with a faint white residue that matched the magnesium powder they had discovered in the slide carrier. Insurance, she said, holding up the gloves for general inspection. Coated with magnesium powder to ensure adequate grip on the murder weapon. Dr. Haydock studied the gloves with professional interest. Quite thorough preparation, nothing left to chance. Nothing except the human element, Miss Marple corrected gently. Mr. Lyle planned the mechanical aspects of his crime with admirable precision, but he failed to anticipate that people would notice anomalies and ask questions. She turned to face the defeated schoolmaster directly. "Tell me, when did you apply the luminous paint to Mr. Brent's chair?" "Yesterday afternoon after Lucy finished cleaning. I had a key to the building, so it was simple enough to return and make the final preparations. I told myself I was just ensuring accuracy, that if I had to act, I wouldn't miss in the darkness." And the magnesium powder, applied to the gloves just before the presentation began. I excused myself briefly, ostensibly to check the electrical connections one final time. Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this catalog of preparation with growing amazement, shook his head in disbelief. "All this planning for what you claim was meant to be just a warning." Lyle's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "I think, Inspector, that I stopped believing my own deception some time ago. Perhaps I never really intended merely to frighten Harold. Perhaps I knew from the beginning that murder was the only solution that would truly protect my father's reputation." The admission hung in the air like an indictment of human nature itself. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic clicking, providing a domestic counterpoint to the moral complexity of the situation. "The tragedy," she said quietly, "is that your father's wartime activities, however irregular, were motivated by compassion. Your response to Mr. Brent's threatened exposure was motivated by pride. The same pride that has now led you to destroy your own life in a futile attempt to preserve his memory." Colin Lyle stood silent for a long moment, contemplating the wreckage of his carefully ordered existence. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of genuine remorse. "My father helped people because it was right. I killed a man because I was afraid. The irony is not lost on me, Miss Marple." Inspector Slack stepped forward with official finality. "Colin Lyle, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Brent. You will be charged with premeditated murder." As the formal processes of justice began to unfold, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and prepared to depart. The truth had been revealed, the guilty party identified, but she found little satisfaction in the resolution. Another life had been destroyed by the very human failings that seemed to drive so many of the tragedies she encountered. The assembly rooms, scene of what should have been a pleasant evening of village nostalgia, now held memories of a darker sort. Some events, she reflected, were perhaps better left unrecorded in the annals of St. Mary Mead's history. Chapters Hai-Wen. 9. A letter from an old friend. The evening shadows had begun to lengthen across the assembly rooms when Miss Evelyn Pryor approached Miss Marple. With obvious reluctance, the honorary secretary's usual composure had been badly shaken by the day's revelations, and she clutched a white envelope in her trembling fingers as though it contained something venomous. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "I'm afraid there's something else you should see. Something I discovered in poor Mr. Brent's jacket pocket when I was tidying up his personal effects." Miss Marple accepted the envelope with her characteristic gentle attention, noting immediately the quality of the paper and the precise manner in which the address had been typed. The envelope bore Harold Brent's name in neat block letters, with no return address or postal markings to indicate its origin. "Found in his pocket, you say? How very interesting that Mr. Brent should have received correspondence on the very evening of his death." She withdrew the letter with careful fingers, unfolding a single sheet of typing paper that bore a brief but significant message. The typeface was clean and professional, the sort produced by a well-maintained office machine. From an old friend, Miss Marple read aloud. "Harold, I urge you to reconsider your planned revelations this evening. Some truths are better left buried, particularly when they concern wartime decisions made under desperate circumstances. Be kind to the truth, tonight, and to those who acted from compassion rather than greed. The past deserves understanding, not judgment, Dr. Haydock, who had remained to observe the conclusion of the investigation, frowned thoughtfully, rather an eloquent plea for discretion. Did Mr. Brent mention receiving such correspondence? Miss Pryor shook her head. Not to me, though Harold wasn't one to discuss his private affairs. He seemed quite determined to proceed with his presentation as planned. Miss Marple studied the letter with the same methodical attention she had brought to every other aspect of the case. The typing was remarkably consistent, with only minor variations that spoke of a skilled operator working on familiar equipment. The typewriter, she mused, produces a rather distinctive impression. That oval formation of the letter O and the slightly elongated dash mark, quite characteristic of certain makes of machine. Colin Lyle, who had been sitting in dejected silence while Inspector Slack completed his preliminary paperwork, looked up sharply at this observation. The color that had begun to return to his face drained away once more. "Miss Marple," Lady Bantry said quietly, "you have that look again." "What have you noticed?" "I've noticed that this letter was typed on the same machine that produced the school notices we examined earlier, the same oval O marks, the same distinctive dash formation that we observed on the notice board." The implications of this discovery settled over the room like a chill wind. If Colin Lyle had typed the letter himself, it suggested a level of psychological manipulation that transformed the nature of his crime from simple murder to something far more complex. "Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple said gently, "would you care to explain why you wrote to Mr. Brent under the guise of being an old friend?" Lyle's composure, already badly damaged by the day's revelations, crumbled entirely. "I hoped, that if I appealed to his better nature, reminded him of the human cost of his revelations, he might reconsider his plans. And when that appeal failed, he brought the letter with him last evening, showed it to me before the presentation began, laughed about it, said it only confirmed his suspicions that someone had something to hide." He was more determined than ever to proceed. Inspector Slack looked up from his papers with renewed interest. "So you tried persuasion first, then resorted to murder, and that failed." "The letter was genuine," Lyle protested weakly. "I meant every word of it. I was trying to make him understand that my father's actions came from compassion, not greed." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Mr. Lyle, what exactly did you know about your father's wartime activities? Had you discovered them independently, or did Mr. Brent's research bring them to your attention?" The question seemed to strike at the heart of Lyle's psychological state. He buried his face in his hands before answering. "I'd always known there were irregularities. As a child, I remembered extra food appearing in our larder, mysterious visitors who came to collect parcels in the evening, but I never questioned it. During wartime, so many things seemed unusual. And your father never explained his activities. He died believing he'd served his community honorably. It wasn't until Harold began his research that I learned the full extent of what had happened." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "You mean Brent's investigation revealed facts about your father that you hadn't known?" Harold had documentation, ledgers showing discrepancies in Red Cross distributions, photographs of hampers being delivered to unauthorized recipients, even testimony from people who remembered receiving unexpected assistance. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking as she contemplated this revelation. "So, in attempting to protect your father's memory, you were actually defending actions you had only recently learned about in detail. The irony is devastating, isn't it?" Lyle's voice carried a note of bitter self-awareness. "I committed murder to preserve a reputation that might not have needed defending. If I had simply allowed Harold to present his evidence fairly—" "What do you mean?" Lady Bantry asked with evident confusion. Lyle looked up with the expression of a man who had finally recognized the full extent of his folly. Harold's research was thorough, but it was also one-sided. He had documented the irregularities, but he hadn't investigated the circumstances that motivated them. He didn't know about Mrs. Weatherby's invalid daughter, or the Johnson family's hidden poverty, or any of the other situations my father had quietly addressed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Your father was redistributing supplies to people who genuinely needed them, but were too proud or too overlooked to receive official assistance. Exactly. Harold saw only the paperwork discrepancies, not the human realities behind them. If I had simply explained the circumstances, provided context for my father's actions, the scandal might have become a story of wartime compassion instead. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and tragic misunderstanding. Inspector Slack, who had little patience for psychological complexity, cleared his throat impatiently. Be that as it may, Mr. Lyle, you chose murder over explanation. The court will have to sort out your motives. Miss Marple carefully placed the letter in her handbag, another piece of evidence in a case that had revealed as much about human nature as about criminal methodology. The tragedy, she said quietly, is that both you and Mr. Brent were acting from principles you believed to be honorable. He sought truth and historical accuracy. You sought to protect your father's memory. Neither of you considered that truth might be more complex than either of your perspectives. Aloud, Colin Lyle stood as inspector. Slack prepared to escort him from the assembly rooms. Miss Marple, do you think my father would have forgiven me for what I've done? The question hung in the air like a prayer seeking absolution. Miss Marple's expression was infinitely compassionate as she replied, I think, Mr. Lyle, that your father would have wanted you to trust in the fundamental decency of your community. People understand the difference between compassion and greed, between helping others and helping oneself. The truth, properly told, would have honored his memory rather than destroying it. Chapter 10. Fuse Cupboard. Graphite, Glow, and Motive. The morning following Colin Lyle's arrest dawned gray and subdued, as though the village itself were in mourning for the innocents lost in the assembly rooms. Miss Marple arrived early to find Inspector Slack already present, along with Lady Bantry and the core members of the Friends Committee, who had requested this final gathering to understand completely how their pleasant evening of reminiscence had transformed into tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began, standing beside the fuse cupboard where so much of the evidence had been discovered, I thought it might be helpful to review exactly how this carefully planned murder was accomplished, and why it came to seem necessary to the perpetrator. Mrs. Ellison, who had maintained her dignified composure throughout the investigation, spoke first. I confess, Miss Marple, that I still find it difficult to believe Colin could have planned such an elaborate deception. He seemed such a conscientious young man. Indeed, he was conscientious, Mrs. Ellison. Perhaps too much so for his own good. Miss Marple opened the fuse cupboard with careful precision. The first element of Mr. Lyle's plan involved creating a precisely timed electrical failure. He achieved this by substituting graphite, pencil lead, for a portion of the fuse wire. She indicated the blackened porcelain housing where traces of the substitution remained visible. When the magic lantern drew power at 8:30, the graphite heated under the electrical load and eventually parted, creating the blackout exactly when Mr. Brent would be settling into his reserved seat. Dr. Haydock examined the evidence with professional interest. Remarkable precision. He must have calculated the timing based on the power consumption of the lantern. Precisely, Mr. Lyle's scientific training served him well in this regard. Miss Marple withdrew the small tin labeled fuses from the cupboard shelf. The pencil kept in this tin, chewed at the end in a nervous habit, provided both the graphite for the electrical substitution and evidence of recent preparation. Lady Bantry shuddered slightly. Such cold calculation, and all to create a moment of darkness for murder. But darkness alone would not have been sufficient, Miss Marple continued, moving toward Harold Brent's abandoned chair. In absolute blackout, even a carefully planned attack might miss its target. Mr. Lyle needed a way to see exactly where Mr. Brent was positioned. She gestured toward the chair back, where the polished leather still held traces of its sinister modification. Luminous paint, from wartime ARP signage, applied to this chair during the afternoon before the presentation. In normal lighting, completely invisible, but in total darkness, it provided just enough glow to outline Mr. Brent's head and shoulders. Miss Evelyn Pryor pressed a handkerchief to her lips. How could we not have noticed? How could Colin sit among us knowing what he planned to do? Because, my dear Miss Pryor, he had convinced himself that he was acting from noble motives. Miss Marple's tone carried infinite sadness. He believed he was protecting his father's memory from unjust scandal. She moved to the equipment table where the slide carrier, the murder weapon, still lay among the photographic apparatus. The final element involved ensuring accuracy in the, darkness. Mr. Lyle coated his gloves with magnesium powder from a deliberately broken flashbulb, providing additional grip for swinging this heavy brass carrier. Inspector Slack, who had remained silent during most of the reconstruction, stepped forward. The planning was meticulous. I'll give him that. Nothing left to chance. Nothing except human nature, Miss Marple corrected gently. Mr. Lyle planned the mechanical aspects of his crime with scientific precision, but he failed to account for the fact that people notice anomalies and ask questions. She indicated the various pieces of evidence that had unraveled. His careful scheme, the graphite residue in the fuse cupboard, the luminous paint on both chair and victim, the magnesium powder in the slide carrier, each element perfect in isolation, but collectively pointing to deliberate preparation. Lucy Denham, who had been listening with growing distress, finally spoke. But why didn't he simply explain about his father's wartime activities? Surely people would have understood the difference between theft and compassion. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. That question goes to the heart of this tragedy, Miss Denham. Mr. Lyle acted from fear rather than knowledge. He had only recently learned the full extent of his father's irregular distributions through Mr. Brent's research, and he saw only the documented discrepancies, not the human circumstances that motivated them. She withdrew the letter from her handbag, the typewritten plea that had failed to deter Harold Brent from his intended revelations. This letter represents Mr. Lyle's final attempt at persuasion before resorting to violence. When Mr. Brent dismissed it and became more determined than ever to proceed, Mr. Lyle felt he had no alternative. Dr. Haydock studied the letter with continued fascination. The irony is that Brent's research, while thorough in documenting irregularities, was incomplete in understanding motivations. Exactly. Mr. Brent had uncovered evidence of unauthorized redistributions, but he hadn't investigated why those redistributions occurred. He saw corruption where compassion might have been the more accurate interpretation. Mrs. Ellison shook her head sadly. So Colin committed murder to prevent the revelation of activities that might not have been scandalous at all if properly explained. The tragedy runs deeper than that, Miss Marple replied. Mr. Lyle's father apparently died believing he had served his community honorably. The son's attempt to preserve that belief has now ensured that the family name will be associated with murder rather than wartime charity. The weight of this observation settled over the assembled group like a funeral shroud. The very act intended to protect the Lyle family's reputation had destroyed it more completely than any historical research could have accomplished. There's another element to consider, Miss Marple continued, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Mr. Lyle marked multiple programs in advance, indicating he had been planning this crime for several days. The crossed items marked precisely which moments would require his attention, the blackout timing and the slide that was never to be shown. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Premeditation established beyond doubt. The courts will have no difficulty with the charges. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, one cannot help but feel sympathy for a son's desire to protect his father's memory. The methods were inexcusable, but the motivation was fundamentally loving. She moved to the window where the morning light illuminated the peaceful village street beyond. This case reminds us that good intentions, unchecked by wisdom and distorted by fear, can lead to consequences far worse than the problems they were meant to solve. Lady Bantry joined her friend at the window. What will happen to Colin now? He'll face trial for premeditated murder. His confession and the overwhelming physical evidence make the outcome virtually certain. Miss Marple's voice carried deep regret. A life destroyed by the very impulse that should have made him a better man, love for his father. As the small group began to disperse, each member carrying away their own reflections on the tragedy that had befallen their community, Miss Marple remained for a moment longer in the assembly rooms. The bunting still hung from the walls, jarringly cheerful against the somber reality of what had transpired beneath it. Past darkness, friend murder, she murmured, echoing Lady Bantry's words from the evening of Harold Brent's death. Some people curate the past as though it were a cupboard, putting things in, taking things out. But cupboards accumulate dust. Fuses betray their tampering, and a glow, however faint, reveals where a blow is intended. The autumn sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the empty chair where Harold Brent had sat for the last time, and Miss Marple reflected that some exhibitions of village history were perhaps too costly to mount.